Tonight, we're in our Freedom From series again tonight, part 6, Freedom to Live for Today. We've covered a number of topics in this series. Excuse my voice, I'm a little bit hoarse tonight. Freedom from needing to control others. We've talked about freedom from needing to be controlled, freedom from condemnation, and last week was freedom from want or coveting. And tonight it's freedom to live for today. And so, I think we can all choose to live in one of 3 time zones. And I don't mean physical time zones, I mean sort of mental time zones. Living in the past, the present, or the future. And I think we get to choose which time zone we live in. The time zone you choose to spend most of your time in your mind, will have quite an impact on how your life goes. So first we'll talk about living in the past. There's a number of different ways that we live in the past in our minds. One is living in the good old days. Now, my parents used to like to watch old programs on television and reliving the good old days, the glory days. Thinking that nothing can compare today to the way things were, that kind of thinking. There's even a magazine called Good Old Days Magazine. Look at that. And the subtitle, if you see way up the top, the magazine that remembers the best. So that's the kind of thinking I'm cautioning us about today, is to think that everything was better in the past. Because if you think that everything was better in the past, sets you up for not expecting anything could be better today or in the future. You think your better days, your best days are behind you. It plays into the old time religion, give me that old time religion. There's a church up on Route 1 north of Holton that's called the Old Time Gospel Church or something like that. You've probably seen it there. So the people so fascinated with the past that they name the church after it. Cracker Barrel restaurant is kind of like in that mindset, right? There's lots of old stuff hanging on the walls. There's lots of reminiscing going on in the gift shop in Cracker Barrel restaurant. Churches do this, wanting to return to past moves of God. If you've been in Pentecostal churches especially, there's a lot of people that pine away for the good old days of revival. Somebody might have remembered the 40s when there was a certain kind of revival in the 40s. The 70s, the charismatic renewal. People will pine away for moves of God like that. Revivalism is an example of this, I think. We see this a lot today. People praying for God to move, trying to please God through more and more prayer, hoping that He'll send revival. A bigger and better revival than we've had before. People prophesy about it. Oh, there's the biggest revival coming. I'm not a revivalist. I've been a revivalist. I've been involved in several revivals. I can say yes, there is some good fruit that come from them, but I see how they start, how they grow, and how they crash and burn, because they almost always crash and burn. And often in that crashing and burning, lots of people get hurt, and that's not healthy. I don't think that's a healthy kind of thinking. So revivalists claim that they're praying for the future, but more often they actually seem to be seeking a replication of something in the past. They're trying to relive something that they either went through themselves in the past or something they've read about. There's a church in California, Northern California, that part of their revivalist studies is studying past revivals. The Welch Revival, the Azusa Street Revival, lots of revivals, studying those with the eye toward replicating those today. I'm not an advocate for that. I'll just leave it at that. There's another problem with living in the past. It's what I call the failure ceiling. A past failure of yours can become a ceiling that you can't seem to break through in the present. It might have been a business failure, a bankruptcy, a failed marriage, a criminal prosecution. There can be all kinds of failures that you might have gone through, And that seems, if you live back with the cognizance of the awareness of that failure a lot, it can make you feel like you can't exceed that place. You can't get by it. Thomas Edison's a good example of somebody that failed a lot. The guy that invented our light bulbs. He actually failed 6,000 times before he got a working prototype of a light bulb. Let me read this statement. On one occasion, a young journalist challenged Edison, saying to him, "Mr. Edison, why do you keep trying to make light by using electricity when you have failed so many times? Don't you know that gas lights are with us to stay?" To this, Edison replied, "Young man, don't you realize that I have not failed, but have successfully discovered 6,000 ways that won't work?" So he just saw failure not as a failure, but as adding to his knowledge base of what doesn't work, what doesn't seem to give him the desired end. Galatians 6:9 says, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for in due season we will reap if we don't faint." So fear of failing can keep you bound to your past, and it can limit your present to the level of your past failures. So that's not a good place to live. So neither living in reminiscing for the good old days, living at the level of past failures is not a good place to live. And third, perpetual grief. Some people just get stuck in grief over something that's caused them to grieve. Loss of a loved one, a child, or a spouse can get you locked in perpetual grief. A failed relationship. Even maybe you weren't even married, but it was just a close, intimate relationship. Some people get stuck there. So fixation on loss can keep you bound to your past. If you get fixated on something that didn't work out for you in the past. This reminds me of that story of the man of the Gadarenes. Remember the guy that was so possessed by demons? He's called the man of the Gadarenes. He lived among the tombs. What are tombs? Tombs are monuments to past lives. Tombs are monuments to past lives. It's interesting that this guy, so oppressed by demons, lived amongst monuments to past lives. There's no life there. And the longer you live in the grief of a past life, the longer you live and stew and sit in that place, in that memory, I think it actually opens you up to demonic accusations from others and from yourself, like this guy suffered. The truth is, some of the biggest losers in the Bible did extraordinary things after they'd been losers. So just because you've been a failure, you've had failures, you've had losses, does not disqualify you for doing good things. Moses was a good example. Stuttered so badly it was difficult to understand him. He argued with God about God wanting him to do something. He even murdered an Egyptian guy, so that would disqualify most of us. We'd feel like, how could me being a murderer, lead the Israelites out of captivity? But that's exactly what God had him do. So he had to overcome that in his life. He had to overcome that insecurity of being a criminal. Saul, who became Paul, is another really good example. He called himself an enemy of the gospel. He was persecuting Christians, oversaw the stoning of Stephen, but after the meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus, he became the primary apostle to the Gentiles. He wrote more of our New Testament than any other author. He still, though, called himself the worst of sinners, but it didn't stop him from being highly effective. So he didn't deny his past. He understood his past, but he put it in perspective and didn't allow himself to live in the guilt of his past failures, his past mistakes. Peter is another good example. Denied Christ 3 times on the night he was betrayed. That would not go well on your resume today. But became quite an evangelist. Saw 3,000 people saved at Pentecost. People got healed just getting in the way of his shadow. And so all over the Bible, there's stories of people that were failures. God seems to like to use those type of people. What is that? Maybe it's humility. Maybe through our failures, we learn some humility. We gain the ability to be circumspect on our own lives and maybe not so proud and so sure of ourselves. That could be the case. I think God loves to redeem losers. Living in the past, remember Paul said, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." This is a very bold statement. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. If you live in the past, though, you're living in denial of that statement or that truth. You're living in denial of the fact that Christ is a stronger force in you than you are yourself. You can do all things when Christ strengthens you. So there's 3 reasons I think it's not good to live in the past. But for whatever reason you might be stuck in the past, there's a limit to what you or Satan can do with your past. That's because you know the facts of your past. You were there, right? You lived through it. So as bad as your past was, it's difficult to make it worse than it was because you were there. I mean, you can heap guilt on yourself, and you can condemn yourself, certainly. But when you think back of the facts of whatever your past failures were, you know, because you were there. You were intimately involved in your failure. So living in the future can be more dangerous than living in your past because the future isn't written yet. And you can construct a really bad future because there are no facts yet about the future. Living in the future can be an insidious, debilitating experience, even worse than living in the past. So how do we live in the future? What if is a common way that we live in the future. What if this happens? What if that happens? Worrying, in other words, worrying about the future. What if I lose my job? What if my spouse leaves me? What if I fail this test? What if I get cancer? What if aliens invade and turn me into a zombie? I don't know. There's all kinds of stuff we can worry about. It eats my brains, what little of them there are left. Huh? The future actually is a dangerous place to live because the future is unknown. It doesn't exist yet. It's a blank slate. The future does not yet exist for you. The Bible says that God is the Alpha and the Omega, but we're not. In other words, the future for us has not been written yet. I'm not a Calvinist, so I don't think that God has established this drama and I'm just playing a bit role in it. I don't think that's the case. I think that God cooperates with us and the future has some flexibility. So here's a question. How many of us here can predict the future? Anybody? Anybody predict your future? And seeing no hands, I'll say we can't predict the future. So what I want you to do, since you've confessed that you can't predict your future, is take a few seconds and think about something that you worry about. Think about something that causes you worry, any kind of worry at all, but only with one restriction. The thing that you're worrying about cannot predict the future in any way. It's kind of difficult, isn't it? If you have something that you're worried about that might come to pass in the future, but you take away your predicting that event to happen. It's tough to the lie then we took about thoughts, emotions, actions. The lie in this case is I can predict the future. Because if you worry, you're constructing a future that you've already confessed to me that you can't predict. So if you can't predict the future, then why spend time worrying about it? The truth is you don't know what's going to happen 1 minute from now, let alone tomorrow or a week from now. We just don't know. And if you can't predict the future, why spend the time worrying about it? Because it's not going to do anything. It's wasted time. It'll keep you from recognizing and working on what God has for you to do right now. Actually, another way to think about it is worrying is to put faith in the devil rather than God. To exercise, because usually if you're worrying, you're expecting something bad to happen, all right? Faith in God, do you have faith in God because you're expecting something bad to happen? Probably not. Probably you're having faith in God because you expect good things to happen. Yes, you will have trouble, right? But I wouldn't say it's God that sends it, right? No, we will have trouble. So, yeah. That's another whole good topic to go on. So that's one way that we live in the future that's negative. Worrying, basically worrying means I'm trying to predict the future. I don't have that ability to predict the future, so I ought to stop doing that. Another one is personal prophecy. It's kind of a caution, and I'm not against personal prophecy, but I'm against some of it. I'll say it that way. Some run from place to place seeking words of personal prophecy. Whenever there's a quote prophet around, they make sure they're there. And sadly, I've known quite a few Christians who don't do much of anything in the present because they're waiting on a prophetic word to come to pass, or they're waiting for somebody to validate a former prophetic word that they've had, and they just sit around waiting for that thing to come to pass, and it can arrest your development. This is pretty bad because prophetic words are supposed to reveal what can happen, but in many cases it actually stops the person's growth. Like if you got a prophetic word that you're going to be a brain surgeon, I would hope you'd try to get into college, into med school, because you're not operating on my brain without getting into med school. Sorry, but I know people that just they expect God to do all the work to bring the prophetic word to pass, and that's just not the way it's supposed to work. Back to the future believers, kind of like, constantly prophesying about what God is about to do, yet unable to see or cooperate with God in what he is doing already today. Not doing much in the present. One of my pet peeves is the great wealth transfer. Benny Hinn talks about this, and you hear other people talk about the great wealth transfer. It's a faulty reading of Proverbs 13. It causes people to sit around waiting for sinners to give them money. It says the wealth of the wicked is going to come to the righteous, is what that verse says. Well, yeah, it does occasionally, but often the righteous have something to do with that. It's not just somebody that's handing money out willy-nilly. The stories about Jesus in the Gospels were not about what he would someday do, and they weren't about things that he had done in his past. Interesting that we don't know anything really about Jesus prior to his baptism. So the Bible doesn't tell us about what he did before, and the stories in the Gospels are not what he's going to do. The stories about what he did. The Acts of the Apostles is about what they did in the 40 or so years after Pentecost, not what they hoped to do and not what they did prior to that. So this is why I think living in the future is more of a problem than living in the past. The past already happened. You can't make it worse than it was. The future, though, is yet to happen. You can keep imagining it worse and worse and worse. So then I've heard people say, well, I'll just think good things about the future then. The power of positive thinking, right? And I think that's good. I think we should think positively. But I've seen people speak good things, think good things about the future, and then when they don't come to pass, they get discouraged about them. And some people I've seen walk away from the faith because of this. This faith thing doesn't work. But I think that's because we've given them false expectations, like Sherry Ann just mentioned. We will have trouble in this world. Faith is not a remedy for trouble. Faith helps us get through it, but it's not an escape valve out of it, right? So that's my problems with living in the past and living in the future. So let's talk about living for today. Even Jesus, when he was here, lived in the here and now. He lived in the present 2,000 years ago. So the stories we read about Jesus in the Gospels are present-day stories that happened, of course, 2,000 years ago. Jesus only did what he saw his Father doing. He only did what he saw his Father doing, not what he had seen his Father do, and not what his Father would be doing tomorrow. This verse is interesting to me. He only did what he saw his Father doing. So that it conjures up the idea that Jesus and his Father were communicating, that they were on the same page. And that I think often when Jesus broke away to pray and be by himself, some of that was his Father preparing him for what he was going to do the next day. And so he was able to do that. Give us today our daily bread, is how Jesus taught us to pray in Matthew 6. He didn't tell us to pray for tomorrow's food or yesterday's food, but today's food. Give us today our daily bread. Blessed are you who hunger now, Jesus said also in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. So God provides for today's needs today. 2 Corinthians 6 says, as God's co-workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. For he says, in the time of my favor I heard you, and in the day of salvation I helped you. I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. Paul is kind of pleading with the Corinthians to recognize that to live in the present. Now, don't be waiting for the day of God's salvation. Don't be waiting for God to do something for you. He's already done that. It's our job to receive what he's already done. God's grace is for today, this passage tells us, not for yesterday and not for tomorrow. It's perishable, if you will. God's grace is kind of like groceries. It comes, it's kind of like the manna in the wilderness, right? It came each morning. It's God's grace, I think, is received in vain when you try to apply it to your past or to your future. It's not the way it works. Now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. Lamentations 3 says, because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. This word compassion is often translated mercy. God's mercy is new every morning. He doesn't give us day-old mercy. We don't have an out-of-date sticker on God's mercy. It comes new every day. They are not sufficient then for yesterday or for tomorrow, but they are sufficient for today. Worrying about the future is futile because there's no compassion or mercy yet for tomorrow, is what these verses seem to tell us. They seem to tell us, let's rely on God in the present. Let's live in the present. James 4. Now listen, you who say tomorrow or today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes, and all such boasting is evil. So I think James is just pointing out the futility of living in the future. I don't think he's saying don't make plans. He's saying to submit your plans to the Lord. Don't plan on all by yourself. If it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. Proverbs 3 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not unto your own understanding, right? In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. I think that's just telling us, I think it is good to make plans. You know, the world we live in now, you have to make some plans. And when we ran our business, we planned for the future. But we thought often about it, and we had a variety of believers and unbelievers in there. So, but those of us that were believers in our departments, when we planned for the future, we tried to submit our plans to the Lord, to or pray about them and say, what is a reasonable expectation for what we should expect over the next year, and so forth. So, boasting is what I think James is getting at here. You boast in your arrogant schemes. So it's not that James is or God is against planning; he's against us being boastful and arrogant about it. In Matthew 6, this is from the Sermon on the Mount, of course, and I'll read this passage, verse 27 through 34 from the Message. It's too long to put on the screen, sorry. Has anyone, by fussing in front of the mirror, ever even got taller by so much as an inch? All this time and money wasted on fashion. Do you think it makes that much difference? Instead of looking at the fashions, walk out into the fields and look at the wildflowers. They never primp or shop, but have you ever seen color and design quite like that? The 10 best-dressed men and women in the country look shabby alongside them. If God gives such attention to the appearance of wildflowers, most of which are never even seen, don't you think he'll attend to you, take pride in you, do his best for you? What I'm trying to do here is to get you to relax, to not be so preoccupied with getting, so you can respond to God's giving. People who don't know God and the way he works fuss over these things. But you know both God and how he works. Steep your life in God reality, God initiative, God provisions. Don't worry about missing out. You'll find all your everyday human concerns will be met. Give your entire attention to what God is doing right now. And don't get worked up about what may or may not happen tomorrow. God will help you deal with whatever hard things come up when the time comes. Eugene Peterson's translation. So I just have 4 confessions, and what I'd like to do is I'll put them on the screen, and I'll let you read them first, because I don't want to make you read something you don't want to confess. But take a moment and read this first confession, and then I'll lead us in saying this together, if you'd like to. Okay, those of you who want to read it, we'll do it. I choose to not live in my past. I have learned from my past mistakes, hurts, and failures, and they will no longer limit my present. I also will not live in unbelief by idolizing the good old days. Instead, I will thank God for what he has done and have faith for even greater things today. Good. Here's the second one. Take a minute and read that. All right, here we go. I release my future to the one who loves me and who is able to do exceedingly above all I could ask or think. I won't worry about my future, because to worry is to have faith in the devil. And today I'm putting all my faith and all my hope in God. That's a good one. Okay, here's number 3. All right, here we go. Today I choose to relax and not be so preoccupied with getting, so I can respond to God's giving. I give my entire attention to what God is doing right now and won't get worked up about what may or may not happen tomorrow. God will help me deal with whatever hard things come up when the time comes. All right, and one more. Okay, I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. Tomorrow belongs to the Lord, so I'm placing all my tomorrows in God's hands, knowing that if they are good, I'll rejoice. If they are bad, I will learn from them. And if I die, I get to be with Jesus. All right. What's the worst that can happen to you? You get to be with Jesus. So anyway, that's what I had to say about living in the present. As Christians, we are about living in the present and the eternal. The eternal, though, is not the future. Sometimes you think of the eternal as the future. The eternal is where God lives. We live in the present. C.S. Lewis wrote in the Screwtape Letters, "The present is the point at which time touches eternity." So when we live in the present, that's, I think, what he's trying to say is that we have the nearest access to God, who is eternal, when we're fully living in the present, when we're fully alive in the here and now, rather than being stuck in the past or too fixated on what might go wrong in the future. Now, one thing I didn't talk about is visionaries, and I think there is a place for people having visions and being visionary type people, and I think we need those. I think without visionary people, we wouldn't make much progress in a lot of areas. So I don't think that. I'm thinking in the future, living in the future, more in a negative sense, in the sense of worry. If you worry and you're afraid of what might happen, what might go wrong, those kind of things, even if you're a visionary, if you allow those concerns to outweigh your excitement about the good thing you're visionary about, you won't get anywhere with it. So I'm not discounting living in the future altogether, just not allowing it to keep you stuck in the present.